The water came at night, not from the sky, from the drainage channel on the county road 300 meters north of Ruth Calloway's farm, a concrete culvert that had carried stormwater safely past her property for 41 years. On the night of the 7th of March, that culvert was redirected. Nobody saw who did it, but by morning, the lower 18 acres of Calloway farm were underwater. And by the following evening, when the floodwater had settled to stillness and Ruth was standing at the edge of what used to be her best corn ground in her rubber boots in 6 inches of cold brown water, she looked down. And she saw something in the mud beneath her feet that should not have been there. Something old, something deliberate, something that told her this land held a secret that the people trying to take it had no idea they were about to expose. If you've ever believed that ordinary people can outthink powerful interests through patience, knowledge, and the willingness to look at things more carefully than everyone else, this channel exists for you. Subscribe to the Rural Files, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing where these stories land. Ruth Calloway was 63 years old when the flood came. She had been farming the same 220 acres in the Broad River Valley of Marist County, Tennessee, since her father passed the property to her in 1987. Her grandfather had cleared the lower acres in 1931. Her father had built the drainage system that moved water reliably off the bottomland after every hard rain. Her own husband, who died in 2004, had planted the windbreak of white oaks along the eastern edge that everyone in the county now used as a landmark to navigate the valley road. 3 generations. 93 years of continuous management. The land knew the Calloway family the way land knows the people who have paid attention to it for a very long time. It showed them things. It had been showing Ruth things for 36 years. She was not the kind of farmer who looked at her fields in the abstract. She walked them in every season. She noted where the soil changed color after rain. She observed where the morning frost held longest, and what that told her about the moisture below. She had notebooks going back 20 years, small hardback journals filled with observations most people would have considered too minor to record. She had recorded them anyway. Which is why, when the water came and settled and went still on the morning of the 8th of March, and she looked down at her feet and saw the line in the mud running in a direction that no natural drainage line would run, she recognized it immediately as something that needed to be understood rather than dismissed. But before we get to what she found, it is important to understand why the water came at all, because it did not come by accident. Marist County had been in the process of a significant infrastructure expansion for 3 years before the flood. A proposed industrial logistics corridor, a network of access roads, rail sidings, and warehousing facilities running north to south through the valley, had been approved in principle by the County Development Commission in 2019, following a series of meetings that most farmers in the valley had not been invited to attend. The corridor needed flat, well-drained land close to the existing highway interchange. The Calloway farm sat in the middle of the most desirable section of the route. The development company, a regional infrastructure firm whose name appeared in the county records as Marist Valley Partners LLC, had made Ruth 4 offers over 22 months. The first was reasonable, the second was generous, the third was large enough that Ruth's daughter in Nashville drove out to the farm for the weekend to have a conversation about it. Ruth listened to her daughter the way she listened to everything, carefully, without rushing to a response. Then she said, "Your grandfather broke this ground in 1931. Your father was born in that house. I'm not going to be the one who decides that ends." The fourth offer was twice the third. Ruth declined it by letter, through a solicitor, without a phone call. The letters that followed the fourth refusal were not from the development company. They were from the County Drainage Authority, citing a review of the infrastructure north of the Calloway property and indicating that some modifications to the culvert system might be necessary as part of a broader valley stormwater management plan. Ruth filed 2 objections. Both were acknowledged. Neither was acted upon. And on the night of the 7th of March, the culvert was modified. 18 acres of Calloway bottomland, the flat, deep-soiled, perfectly drained lower field that her grandfather had spent 3 seasons getting right, went underwater in 11 hours. The development company's lawyers described it as a natural flood event related to above-average spring rainfall. The rainfall that week had been 4 inches above the seasonal average. It had also been 4 inches above average on every surrounding property in the valley, none of which flooded. Ruth knew the difference between a natural flood and a managed one. She had lived long enough and observed her drainage system carefully enough to know that the water on her land was not moving the way natural stormwater moves. Natural floodwater fans out. It follows the lowest point of the landscape. It fills depressions first, moves toward channels, and exits through the same routes it entered from. The water on Ruth's lower field was not doing any of those things. It was pooling against the natural gradient. That is physically difficult to achieve without intervention. She photographed it on the second morning with a camera she mounted on a tripod in the bed of her pickup truck, so the angle was high enough to capture the water surface and its direction of pooling against the known contour lines of the lower field that her father had surveyed and recorded in 1968. She had those contour records in a filing cabinet in the farmhouse. She pulled them out that evening and spread them on the kitchen table and compared them to the photographs. The water was pooling in exactly the locations that the 1968 survey showed as the highest points of the lower field. It was being held there by something. And that was when the second mystery appeared, because the water, which should have been murky with disturbed topsoil after 11 hours of inundation, was clearing, faster than it had any right to. By the second morning it was brown amber, rather than brown gray. By the third morning it had the specific quality of water that is moving through something, being filtered by something, rather than simply sitting. Ruth stood in it on the third morning and felt, through the soles of her rubber boots, a faint resistance beneath her feet that she did not recognize as mud. She crouched in the ankle-deep water and reached down. Her hand found something solid, not rock, not compacted clay, something cut, something shaped. She called her neighbor Eugene the following morning. Eugene Marsh was 71 years old and had grown up on the adjacent farm before selling it in 2003 and moving to a smaller place 3 miles north. He had known this valley since childhood. He knew its history the way that rural communities carry history, not in books but in layers, in half-told stories that surface when something specific is asked about something specific. Ruth drove to Eugene's house and showed him the photographs. She showed him the one of the stone edge she had found with her hand in the third morning water. Eugene looked at it for a long time. Then he said a name, Harlan's Race. Ruth did not know what that meant. Eugene explained. In the pre-Civil War period, between roughly 1840 and 1860, a system of stone-lined water channels had been constructed across the lower valley by a farming collective that operated the bottomland before the county was formally surveyed and divided into the parcels that became the farms of the 20th century. These channels, called races in the language of that period, were not irrigation channels in the modern sense. They were water management structures. They directed winter and spring floodwater across the bottomland in a controlled pattern that deliberately saturated the lower fields before the growing season, a practice called water meadowing that was common in England and had been brought to Tennessee by farming settlers who knew it. The water was directed across the fields at a specific depth for a specific period, then drained in a specific sequence through stone culverts that had been set at calculated intervals across the field. The result was early grass growth, sometimes 6 to 8 weeks ahead of unmanaged fields, because the controlled flooding both suppressed late frost at the root level and deposited a thin layer of suspended organic sediment across the field as it drained. It was a sophisticated system. It required significant skill and labor to construct, and it had been invisible beneath the Calloway lower field for more than 150 years. Ruth Calloway stood in the flooded field on the 5th morning and began to understand what she was standing on. Not a disaster, an archive. The floodwater was moving through the stone channels of Harlan's Race, the way water moves through any system it was designed to use. The channels were still functional, partially silted, partially obstructed by root growth, but structurally intact beneath 2 meters of alluvial soil that had accumulated over 150 years of normal agricultural use. She spent the next 3 days moving through the field in the water with a metal probe she had made from a section of steel rod, mapping the channels by feel the way a doctor reads something by touch that an instrument would confirm later. She flagged each channel segment with a section of orange survey tape tied to a wire stake she pushed into the channel edge. By the end of the 5th day, she had mapped 23 meters of continuous stone channel. By the end of the 10th day, she had mapped over 200 meters. She called the Tennessee Agricultural and Historical Society on the 11th day. A field historian named Dr. Patricia Ewan arrived on the 14th day with a survey team and a ground-penetrating radar unit that had been used on 2 previous valley sites to locate buried infrastructure. What the radar showed changed the conversation from Ruth's flooded farm to something considerably larger. The channel system extended across the entire lower 18 acres. Not in a simple linear pattern. In a designed grid. Inflow channels along the northern edge. Distribution channels running east-west across the field at calculated intervals. Collection channels at the southern end leading to a primary outlet culvert that was still, after 150 years, sitting at exactly the right level to drain the field at the designed depth of approximately 9 inches. The system was complete. It had been buried, but not destroyed. And it was, Dr. Ewan's words in her preliminary field notes, one of the most intact examples of antebellum water meadow engineering documented in the eastern United States. The County Development Commission received a formal notification from the Tennessee State Historic Preservation Office within 3 weeks of Dr. Ewan's preliminary report. The notification cited the potential presence of a historically significant agricultural infrastructure site on the Calloway property and requested that any development activity in the affected area be suspended pending formal archaeological assessment. The development company's lawyers challenged the notification. The challenge was reviewed. It was denied. The assessment proceeded. Ruth Calloway spent those weeks doing something that nobody in the county's development office had anticipated and that the company's lawyers had not prepared for. She had the field drained, not quickly, slowly, using the race system itself, working with Dr. Ewan's team and a hydrological engineer named Dr. James Okafor from the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Extension Program, a man who had spent his career studying historical water management in the Mid-South and had never seen a system this intact in the field. Ruth opened the primary outlet culvert at the southern end of the field. The water drained in 4 days. It drained at exactly the rate and in exactly the pattern that the system had been designed to produce 150 years ago. Dr. Okafor stood at the southern outlet on the 3rd day and watched the water moving through the stone channel with the expression of someone watching a clock that stopped 150 years ago and has just started running again. He said, to no one in particular, "This is still working." He meant the engineering. But Ruth understood it more broadly. The land was still working. Everything that had been buried by time and alluvial deposit and the specific amnesia that settles over agricultural land when the people who understood it are replaced by people who don't, it was still there, still functional, still doing what it had been built to do. The formal archaeological assessment took 8 months. During those 8 months, the ground-penetrating radar was used across the full extent of the lower field and revealed a channel network covering the entire 18 acres in a grid pattern estimated to have required more than 600 meters of stone-lined channel to complete. The sediment cores taken from the channel beds returned radiocarbon dates consistent with mid-19th century construction. The stone used in the channel lining, a specific gray-blue limestone not naturally occurring on the Calloway property, was traced by geological analysis to a quarry site 4 miles north that appeared in Marist County historical records as an active commercial quarry between 1837 and 1863. The system had been deliberately designed and deliberately built by people who understood water, soil, and seasonal farming cycles at a level of sophistication that had been largely forgotten in the region for a century. The State Historic Preservation Office designated the site as a significant agricultural heritage site in March of the following year. The designation carried with it specific protections against disturbance and made the Calloway lower field ineligible for the kind of surface development that the industrial logistics corridor required. Marist Valley Partners LLC adjusted their route. The corridor moved 3 miles west to a site on higher ground that required significantly more drainage infrastructure to prepare and cost the project an additional 2.5 years in delays. Ruth Calloway was not present at any of the subsequent planning meetings. She was in her lower field. She and Dr. Okafor had spent the previous 6 months designing a management plan for the race system that would restore it to limited operational function, not as a historical curiosity, but as working agricultural infrastructure. Not the full 19th century water meadow operation. That scale of seasonal flooding was no longer compatible with modern farming practice across the whole field, but a modified version of the system that used the stone channels to manage late winter and early spring moisture across a 12-acre section of the lower field in a way that would improve the soil organic matter, support early spring grass establishment, and potentially reduce Ruth's dependence on mechanical irrigation in dry springs. The first experimental season, using a carefully controlled limited inflow in February, produced exactly what the historical records of water meadow practice had described as the primary benefit of the technique: early grass, 6 weeks ahead of the unmanaged sections. Ruth stood in that field on a morning in early April and looked at grass that should not have been there yet. She had read about water meadowing in one of Dr. Yuen's historical documents. She had not entirely believed it would work the first season, but she had learned, over 36 years of walking the same land in every season, that the most important farming lesson is rarely the one you were expecting. The land has been here longer than any of us. It has been managed by people whose names we do not remember, using methods we have mostly forgotten, for purposes we are only beginning to understand again. The water that came to force Ruth out had done something else entirely. It had removed the layers of time between her and the people who had worked this land before her. It had shown her that the ground beneath her feet was not simply a surface to grow things on. It was a document, a record of every person who had ever understood it well enough to change it. And the lesson, if there is one that survives the legal disputes and the historical assessments and the hydrological reports, is simpler than any of it. The people who wanted Ruth's land were asking what it was worth. Ruth had always been asking what it still knew. That is the difference between someone who owns land and someone who understands it. The county road past the Calloway farm is still there. The culvert that was modified on the night of the 7th of March has been restored to its original position following a county engineering review that found the modification had been made without proper authorization. The lower field drains normally now, and in late February, when the season is right and the conditions are correct, Ruth Calloway opens the inlet culvert of Harlan's Race for a carefully measured period of days and lets the water do what it was designed to do 150 years ago. The grass comes early. It always does. The land remembers what people forget. If Ruth's story made you see farmland differently, as a document, as a memory, as something that holds more than it shows, we're glad this found you. Subscribe to the Rural Files for stories from the farms, valleys, and counties where the real work of the land gets done. Leave your state or country in the comments. We read every one.